Today we are on the last day of our program. For today we have titled this day Contra Aesthetics. It's a one-day workshop on the possible relationship between politics, art and philosophy. I would request Soumick to give the introductory note. We'll start.
Thank you, Dev, and I'm delighted to give the introductory note and be part of this 4-day program that we have organized. Today we'll have a set of speakers who are all very dear friends of mine from JNU and outside. So since I kind of gave the name to this workshop, Contra Aesthetics. So I'm supposed to introduce what is the idea of Contra Aesthetics that we were thinking, which eventually translated into this workshop, and of course how it is related to the Cinema and Revolution program that we organized in the last few days. So what I'll do is I'll very briefly speak a bit about this question of contrast that we are calling Contra Aesthetics, and from then onwards we can with the presentations we'll try to look at this problem of art and philosophy and politics in this context of what we understand by the idea of Contra Aesthetics. So what I'll do is I can't improvise that well, so I will just very slowly read out the basic points of what we understand by this term, and then let's see where it goes. So it is not possible for me to develop any sustained argument about the problem of Contra Aesthetics today in 20 minutes or so, and I really don't want to take more time than that. So I can only delineate some of the positions in relation to this. What I meant by Contra Aesthetics when I proposed it as a theme of this workshop was to push the horizon of an existent anti-aesthetic consensus which is already there in current philosophy. There is a tendency already existent within philosophy to give up its mastery, so to speak, over the arts, to return art to the essence proper to itself. In other words, give back to artistic practices and inventions its nature, which philosophy had hitherto usurped in the name of the concept. It proposes that philosophy, by taking art as an object of inquiry, denaturalizes it, strips it of its singular nature, thereby producing an aesthetic judgment. Anti-aesthetics, therefore, provide a general framework to study the singular moments of denunciation of this denaturalization of the artistic process by philosophic thinking. The consequence of this position is that it proposes the freedom or autonomy of art. Through Contra Aesthetics, I wanted to supplement this anti-aesthetical tendency with a contradictory position. It is a position articulated by the Korean-German philosopher Byung-chul in his coinage of the term anaestheticization. As you can understand, anaestheticization is a play on the word anesthesia and aesthetics. It is a position which thinks through the problem of the destruction of aesthetics as a mode of contemplation. But rather than proposing this as an operation of freedom, where art is emancipated from the tyranny of philosophy, it sees this destruction of aesthetic contemplation as the current form of an ideology of positivity. On the other side of the spectrum is the position that it is only philosophic contemplation which can show, not produce, the singularity and the truth of the artistic process, without being able to produce any aesthetic judgment. It is a position which proposes that it is only when philosophy gives up its dominance over art that it is not only art which frees itself from philosophy, but philosophy affirms its own singular operation of affirming something like truth. This position is maintained by the French philosopher Alain Badiou in his invention of the term inaesthetics. I'll try to briefly talk of these contrary positions, anaesthetics and inaesthetics. Anaesthetics, which seeks to rescue aesthetics and in turn philosophy from the tyranny of contemporary ideology of consumable freedom, and inaesthetics, which seeks to rescue philosophy from its own tyranny by giving up what naturally belongs to art, the singularity of its truth. Contra Aesthetics is an effort to map this terrain between these two poles within which the problem of art oscillates today. Anaestheticization, according to Byung-chul that is, sedates our perception and also our capacity for aesthetic contemplation. It is in this sense reactionary. It functions merely as an immediate affective reaction to the object. Only affectivity without contemplation informs our experience of beauty today. It is in fact no longer an experience but an inexperience of beauty which is provoked by an immediate compulsion to consume. It does not require any aesthetic judgment. It does not require any aesthetic judgment, but a simple wow suffices. The haptic compulsion, for example, induced by the smooth surfaces of the sculptures of Jeff Koons, perfectly embodies this tendency. Han remarks, and I quote, "It invites the observer to take an attitude without distance to touch. An aesthetic judgment, however, presupposes a contemplative distance. The art of the smooth abolishes distance." Unquote. Han, however, maps a genealogy, and I think this is the most interesting part of Byung-chul Han's work, that he maps a genealogy of this anaestheticization and places it at the very doorstep of the modern aesthetic consciousness. He argues that the ideology of positivity, which sustains a current aesthetics of the smooths, is already anticipated in both Edmund Burke and Kant. Take, for example, Kant's idea of beauty. Han argues that Kant makes beauty a positive category because it causes a positive pleasure. However, pleasure is not merely an affective category in Kant. It is an epistemological category. The faculty of imagination and understanding both participate in the production of knowledge. Imagination synthesizes the multitude of sensual data presented by the intuitive faculty into a coherent image or a picture, while the faculty of understanding, operating at an upper level, gives meaning to the images, subsuming it under concepts. In the case of aesthetic judgment, however, the cognitive faculties are in a state of what Kant calls a harmonious free play. They do not yet work on production of knowledge. However, they have a purpose, which is exactly this, that they function as a prelude to knowledge as work. Beauty then presupposes work, but in itself is not work, but a harmonious play of faculties. It comes before work and it produces the pleasure through creating a harmony of the faculties of cognition. Beauty may not produce knowledge by itself, but it keeps the machinery of cognition moving. Faced with beauty, the subject likes itself. Beautiful is then an autoerotic feeling. The pleasure in beauty is the pleasure of the self in itself. Even in Kant's idea of the sublime, this self-positivization, affirmation of the self is never abandoned in face of the other. Encountering the sublime of nature, the self immediately returns to itself, to the infinite sublimity of its own reason. The feeling of awe that the sublime evokes is the erroneous feeling of ascribing or projecting the infinite subliminal feeling onto the other, in this case nature. This confusion in Kant is resolved by the truly sublime, which is the feeling of superiority over nature. The sublime, like beauty, the sublime like beauty is not an object, but a subject feeling, an autoerotic feeling of the self. Han sees in this the germ of an ideology of positivity, which infects the society of transparency today. A society of transparency where all forms of negativity are systematically removed, thereby professing an aesthetics of smooth or an anesthetics which sedates aesthetic judgment itself. The autoerotic feeling of beauty, which nevertheless sustains itself as an epistemological category in Kant, becomes a purely affective category in modern consumer society. Beauty and even ugliness simply produces an effect, which even if it is supposed to be negative, is immediately consumed. All traces of contemplative distance, making it the object available for immediate consumption. This accelerated form of consumption through a culture of the like creates an illusion of the real beauty, which always has something negative about it, something finite about it. Today, we are caught in the infinite consumption propagated by the ideology of an anesthetics, a sedentary idea of the beautiful. Against this, Han proposes an activation of the beautiful through the introduction of something like negativity in art. Something we see most vividly perhaps in the recent film by von Trier, The House That Jack Built, where the experience of artistic beauty and the extreme form of physical violence are made indiscernible in order to activate this form of a sedative function of beauty. This is something we can talk about later, perhaps in the discussions. The other term we are concerned with today is inesthetics. Jacques Rancière calls this the unidentified flying object which has landed on our soil and which is based upon just two sentences proposed by Badiou. And I quote from Badiou. By inesthetics, I mean a relation between philosophy and art such that, while positing that art is itself the producer of truths, it in no way claims to turn art into an object of philosophy. By way of contrast to aesthetic judgment, aesthetic speculation, inesthetics describes the strictly intra-philosophical effects brought about by the independent existence of some works of art. Unquote. I'm not going to go in details into this trajectory of the development of this concept of inesthetics in Badiou. For this we can simply read these texts. I am merely going to point out a few consequences of this proposition and then end. Firstly, it proposes that art is capable of producing truths of its own. Something which is immanent to art, that is internal to art, and that is also singular or exclusive to art. Earlier schemas, like the didactic schema, which opens with Plato and perhaps saturates itself in modernity and Marxist philosophy, says something else. It proposes that truth is outside art for example, in the concept of the idea in Plato, or in dialectical materialism for Marxism. Here art can be used as a tool for education. Similarly, there is something like a romantic schema which believes that truth is immanent to art but is not singular to it. Art alone is capable of truth, but that is not simply art's truth. That is truth as such. Art is a privileged ground, the poem particularly, for the infinite truth to descend onto the finite moment of art. Every art object is finite, but in its finitude, the object retreats, withdraws from itself, revealing the impossibility of accessing the truth. It is this revelation of an infinite truth through the withdrawal of the finitude of the artistic work, which is called the romantic schema. This schema traverses from the medieval theological understanding of art to Heidegger. Even Deleuze, Badiou proposes, is part of this schema. Here art entails an encounter which in itself educates. It is no longer used as a tool for education. In other words, there is no difference between art and life. Byung-chul's analysis of art as experience, through which he wants to activate the current inexperience of aesthetic, kind of an anesthetic problem. So this Byung-chul's move can be seen as falling under this category of a romantic schema. And then there is, of course, the classical schema, that truth is not the prerogative of art at all. It is mimesis, which produces something which is not strictly in the domain of knowledge. Which is what? Which is catharsis. Art through imitation produces a transference of passions. Imitation or semblance, therefore, is where the affects are transposed. The resemblance to truth has to be just enough to produce liking. Liking is not opinion, but the effectiveness of catharsis. This scrap of truth, this bit of truth, which imitation carries within itself, produces the transference of passions. So not knowledge of truth, but desire is the prerogative of art. Psychoanalysis would mobilize this schema in the 20th century to articulate a particular function of art which is in the service of desire. This schema is therefore so dedicated to the analysis of art as a problem of desire, which functions as ideology in today's reality. Anyway, these are the schemas against which Badiou proposes his own hypothesis, that there is a singular and immanent truth of art, that this truth does not lie in the singular art objects or works of art. Works of art are finite and are merely localized, immediate enunciations of a configuration. An artistic configuration which makes itself available to something like infinite truth, but always under the imperative of the event. But, and here I must emphasize, the individual work should not be seen, in case of Badiou, as the encounter which is evental. This would mean that the infinite truth of which it is supposed to be a localized articulation, and the event where such an infinite truth originates becomes coincidental. So, the art object's enunciation of truth and the fact that the art object is something, the encounter with the art object is something like an event in itself, Badiou urges us to make a distinction between the two. An artwork is therefore a subject point of truth. In other words, a finite point in an infinite configuration which might be saturated but never exhausted completely. An artistic configuration is therefore like an infinite tapestry of artworks. At any given point, it is always already incomplete. Each artwork is therefore an inquiry of the truth that the artistic configuration carries within itself. An actual artwork is new insofar as it offers an actual localized inquiry of the truth process which has not taken place till now. Take for example the thriller, horror and gangster genres in cinema. Badiou urges us to think that can these works offer a new inquiry into the truth of the artistic configuration opened by Greek tragedy? Can the thriller genre, for example, produce some artistic work which would belong to the infinite possibility opened by the advent of Greek tragedy? How can cinema find a new synthesis between its technological futurity and the ancient problem of tragedy? A new synthesis at the same time between cinema and theatre. Anyway, these are some of the consequences of this line of thinking. A line of thinking art and philosophy which comes under the term inaesthetics. And these are the two poles of the contra aesthetical paradigm, which is what we are trying to understand today. So at one end, we have anaesthetics, where art aggressively becomes a form of ideology, and on the other hand, inaesthetics, which is a way to understand art as producing singular truths. And this brings me to my last point, which is this: that the possibility of a relation is not the same as an existing relation. A possibility can always work both ways. It can become real or actual, or it might not. A possibility to be is always already a possibility to not be. What exists today as a relation between art, politics and philosophy primarily functions under one of the three schemas that we talked of before. To think of a new possibility between them, that is between art, philosophy and politics, therefore does not mean that the old ones just disappear. A possibility can also exist as a possibility to not be. It might exist as an impotentiality, as the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben calls it. So the task, I think, is twofold. Firstly, to investigate if these schemas, these earlier schemas, which we talked about, are actually saturated and cannot be relied upon to think of the relation among the triangulation of philosophy, art and politics today. And secondly, to try out the philosophical proposition that art has its own singular truth, which might help philosophy think better of politics. Or you can put it otherwise, that it can help philosophy think about what is the nature of the singularity of a political truth. So these are some of the questions I think we will be able to understand, perhaps a little better by the end of all of this. Or maybe the other way around, get a bit more confused about what we thought we knew about art and politics, which I think is not such a bad idea after all. Thank you.